What's up, folks? How's it going? This is Watch. Hope you guys are all doing well. And today we're going to be taking a look at the M1 iMac. I've been using this thing for almost 60 days now as my main PC. Been doing most of my video editing, internet surfing, and all my work on this computer. And I'm going to share some of my thoughts and experiences about using this thing on a consistent basis, and if really this thing is the best all-in-one PC that you can get right now, or just a giant glorified iPad Pro. Now, before I go on any further, I do want to mention that this video is brought to you by Skillshare. Now, Skillshare is probably one of the biggest online learning communities designed specifically for creators, or really anybody that wants to acquire a new, useful skill or expand upon their existing knowledge. With a broad spectrum of classes ranging from productivity, business, marketing, as well as more creative endeavors such as fine art, photography, film and video, music, and much more. I've personally used Daniel Scott's classes on Adobe Illustrator and Photoshop many times and found it extremely helpful, and would highly recommend his Essential Training course series on Adobe Photoshop, Illustrator, and InDesign for any beginners out there. Furthermore, I've been really fascinated with 3D illustrations, and DKNG Studios has a great class on creating isometric designs from scratch using Adobe Illustrator. So if you want to make that kind of SimCity-esque dynamic looking three-dimensional artwork on a 2D plane, it's definitely a neat class to check out. Now, if you're interested in trying out Skillshare, the first 1,000 people to use the link in the description down below get a free 1-month trial of their premium membership. Big thanks to Skillshare for making this content possible. But coming back to the topic at hand, firstly, I do have to admit that the design and overall look of the new generation iMac is pretty dang sleek. It's a little bit of a throwback with the 7 different color options to the original G3 iMac that had that big CRT monitor integrated inside. And in the late 90s and early 2000s, where Apple was going through a really hard time, Steve Jobs came back into the company and pretty much saved it from extinction, and the launch of the G3 iMac back in 1998 was probably the key shifting point and product that changed Apple forever, subsequently launching the iPod, iPhone, etc. Perhaps Apple, with the different color options and design throwback, is trying to rekindle some of that creative spirit that made the first generation iMac so great. The evolution of the Apple design continues forward with the M1 iMac. You can see that the design is super thin, ultra minimalistic, which aesthetically is always a great thing, but from a practical perspective, the new iMac is more limited, more locked down, and is less user accessible to upgrades and overall feature longevity. Now, in terms of the display and overall measurements of the 24-inch iMac, the actual display only measures around 11.5 millimeters in terms of thickness, and with the base, the total depth measures around 14.7 millimeters, and the weight is surprisingly light, only 4.5 kilograms, less than around 10 pounds. I remember the original C3 CRT iMac weighed over 60 pounds. Now, the integrated stand is very similar to the previous generation. Basically, you have a high degree of tilting capabilities to get the right viewing angle, but there is no height adjustability. The face of the iMac houses a relatively small bezels around the top and sides of the display. You can see that we still utilize a chin at the bottom portion of the display. This is where all of the silicon and internal components are housed. Due to the fact that the M1 circuit is extremely compact and highly efficient in terms of its packaging, pretty much all of the RAM storage options are fixed onto the chip, so you either can get 8 or 16 gigabytes of unified memory, 256 gigabyte, or up to 2 terabytes of long-term SSD storage, and none of these options can be user accessible or upgraded down the road. So you want to make sure that you get the right iMac when you're first purchasing it. Now, coming back to the display at hand, a super high density resolution. It's Retina certified. You're looking at a native resolution of 4480 by 2520. PPI count is around 218. It can reproduce over 1 billion colors, and it's rated at 500 nits in terms of brightness. It has a True Tone technology as well as wide color P3 certification, so it's pretty much great for any kind of viewing application you can throw at it. The other cool thing about the M1 iMac is it probably has one of the best front-facing FaceTime cams that you're going to find on a desktop PC from Apple. Has a 1080p native resolution, and with the integrated M1 image signal processing capabilities, it can actively tone map as well as reduce the noise in low light situations. So for FaceTiming, video conferencing, this feature becomes super important, especially if you don't want to buy a separate webcam for better video performance. On top of that, you also have a triple mic configuration for better signal to noise ratio for audio capturing, as well as an Adobe Atmos certified surround sound system that houses 6 speakers with force canceling woofers. It actually sounds surprisingly loud, open, and dynamic, which is kind of incredible considering these speakers are housed in a shell that's less than 11.5 millimeters. Now, certainly the biggest downside, I think, of the M1 chip has to be the limitations in terms of ports and connectivity options on pretty much all the Macs right now. And with this baseline model, it gets even worse. You only have 2 Thunderbolt connections or USB 4 connections. Now, obviously, you can adapt a USB 4 Thunderbolt into many different other types of connections with adapters and hubs like what we have over here to add in USB-A connectivity, SD cards, DVI, DisplayPort, HDMI, etc. But having 2 to begin with definitely sucks. If you upgrade to the M1 iMac with the 8-core GPU instead of the 7-core like what we have over here, you do also get additional 2 more USB 3 connections, which is definitely more convenient. And you could also upgrade the baseline configuration to have gigabit Ethernet integrated inside the power supply, which the higher end model comes with already. For whatever reason, Apple still managed to keep the 3.5mm headphone jack connection, which is great if you're going to be using some wired headphones with this PC. Lastly, I do want to mention that the power connection on the M1 iMac is really slick. It's one of the only unidirectional or omnidirectional power ports that you can get out there. Basically, it utilizes a multi-directional circular connection, so you can fit it in any orientation you want. It's not finicky at all like most other power ports you're going to find out there, and it really does fit the whole ethos of the M1 Mac Mini in terms of its sleek integrated design and overall look. Now, the performance of this machine is pretty much going to mirror any M1 Apple Silicon-based Mac that has an 8-core CPU and a 7-core GPU. So just to let you guys know of what I got on Cinebench R15 on the multi-core performance, we're getting over 7,500 points, 1,400 points on the single-core side. Geekbench 5, we're getting over 7,600 points on the multi-core and about 1,700 on the single-core. And Geekbench Metal, we're getting over 20,000 points. From a graphical perspective, using Unigen's Valley benchmark set to 1080p ultra details, we're getting an average frames per second about 43 FPS. And if you're interested in the SSD performance, basically on this 256 gigabyte version using Blackmagic speed test, we're getting about 2.3 and 2.8 gigabytes a second in terms of read and write sequential performance respectively. Now, you guys already know that the M1 processor is definitely a beast. It's comparable to an 8-core Ryzen AMD CPU or a $1,000-$1,200 modern-day PC that you're going to build. And given the right software integration, like most of the Adobe Creative Suite is now fully supportive of the Apple Silicon. So things like Premiere Pro, Photoshop, Lightroom, InDesign, etc. all work pretty well with the Apple-based Silicon for the most part. And you can certainly use this thing for 4K video editing, and any performance-based application that's going to be below that is going to be very easy and efficient to run in a fairly cost and time efficient manner. Of course, for some heavy-duty power users that utilize high-demand resource-based applications, run them at the same time, 16 gigabytes of RAM is definitely going to be a huge bottleneck. Not to mention that 2 terabytes of RAM can fill up pretty fast, especially if you're dealing with high-capacity media files, and even having long-term SSD storage connected to the limited USB ports that you have available on these iMacs is definitely a limiting factor. Not to mention that the gigabit Ethernet data transferring speed from a local area network is going to be fairly slow and is frankly technology that's over 10 years old. Now, given those certain limitations, I do find that there's still going to be a large demographic of people that the M1 iMac is going to be suited perfect for. For example, it'd be perfect for office workers, casual content creators, music music producers perhaps, and several others that can kind of work around the current limitations. For me personally, I'm probably going to go back to my custom built PC and go from there, because I like having a little bit more control over my computing experience, and something like this where you're tied into a box is just too restrictive for my needs. But certainly for other users that want to get an all-in-one PC solution that's relatively fast, super sleek and well integrated, and obviously has that trademark Apple design, this is definitely an excellent all-in-one PC for that, and an excellent upgrade from an older iMac. Besides that, guys, that's really it. I'd definitely love to know what you guys think of the M1 iMac. Are you going to be interested to see whether they're going to come out with a 27-inch version of this, perhaps an M2 version with more ports and connectivity and upgradable options? That will be really cool to see in the future. Definitely give us a thumbs up if you haven't already. Make sure you have post notifications turned on, and check out the description down below to find more details about everything we talked about, including our sponsorship with Skillshare. If you want to try Skillshare for free, definitely click on the description down below to find out more information. And we want to thank Skillshare for making this content possible, and we want to thank you guys for continuing to support and watch the channel. See you later. Take care.